This is the follow-up to a previous video called Path of Exile Gameplay Criticism, in which I discuss 3 core problems with the game and how they're connected. If you watched my full video, thank you, and thank you again for your feedback. So far, the response has been positive, although this could be because the few people willing to click on a criticism video already have their own bone to pick. So I want to briefly talk about the counterarguments, and finally, why argument is even worth our time at all. First, a commentary on human nature. I'm talking about when people dismiss the entire body of an argument outright based on something small or irrelevant. This guy is whining about the XP penalty. That means nothing he says is credible. The trouble is, good argumentation doesn't work like this. It's not like destroying the Death Star. If this stuff were obvious to everybody, I wouldn't need a 13-minute video and 3 others to explain it. If you disagree, you don't need an essay, but you also don't need stuff like this. If we want to do more than just stroke our internet ego, we can't just look for the easiest way to disagree and then declare victory. We have to look for the easiest way to agree and start from common ground, going against our own bias in the interest of understanding. I've done a presentation on this called Steel and Straw that I'll link in the description. Anyways, the stronger counter-arguments usually fall under the "that's not a problem, that's actually fine" category in defense of the status quo. To these, I'll usually ask, okay, but by what standard? By my own standards, these are clearly problem categories, so by what other standard can we get the opposite conclusion, and what are the implications? For example, if PoE is supposed to be like Diablo 2, by what standard do we not want map hack, auto-loot, and bail bots, but we do want Alt F4? This is inductive reasoning. What rules did you use to establish the status quo as fine and compared to what? If the game is fine because it weeds out glass cannons, consider the playstyle that Acts 1 through 10 encourage. How do we distinguish weeding out glass cannons from a typical beginner's trap? And when did steel cannon become less of a concern than glass cannon? If the penalty system is fine because of X, are there no other systems that would also have X but without the undesired consequences? Is it perfect and inalterable just the way it is, or should we be able to criticize it like every other part of the game? These are just some examples. I would respond likewise to each disagreement of this type, and here's why. If we sit down and honestly decide what our standards are, if we open up the status quo of Path of Exile to scrutiny in each of the 3 categories discussed, I don't think it measures up too well. Any standard that upholds the status quo will have absurd implications, either being dogmatically narrow or nihilistically broad. But arguments are cheap, you might say. People like it or don't like it. That's what matters. They don't need an argument. The game is already successful, so it must be hitting its target. Well, what target? The average player, casual players, elite players, streamers, ladder racers, old players, new players, players who don't exist yet, the developers themselves? And how do you know that the target even knows what's in its best interest? This is why arguments matter. But the game is too far gone. Change is impractical. Well, you can say this about any system in the universe, once it gets old enough anyways. There will be some level of resistance to any change, to anything. We take for granted how good a spot Path of Exile is in to solve these problems compared to other games. Look at what it already has. Customization, action, replay value, a non-pay-to-win model, frequent updates, and leagues perfect for testing ideas. These are all rare qualities, especially nowadays, to have all wrapped into one game. Even if we aren't certain on how to move forward, we know what backwards looks like. Pushing the boulder up the hill might be difficult, but it's no excuse to push it down the hill. Look at all the changes that have been made to PoE that, in hindsight, were pretty risky. Crafting stations, daily quests, ascendancies, Delve, the Act 10 crunch, making the game in the first place. Nothing I suggested is crazier than what's already happened. Doing nothing is crazy. Don't believe me? Let's do an in-game survey. Right there, clickable icon. Ask players how important they really think various issues are on a scale of not to very. The results of a survey like this would be enlightening. even in spite of survivorship bias. Let me propose a simple angle to attack from. Get people to play together. Why? Well, besides the obvious, because it strengthens the connection between the good and the bad parts of the game. One of the reasons things have gotten so bad is the lack of these connections, the lack of short-term consequences to long-term troubles. Imagine the game as a machine whose parts are coming loose. Problems accumulate as the connection between the working parts and the failing parts weaken. They can't feel each other, and they can't check each other. Once other players become a feature of the game, connections are strengthened, and things won't have to reach the breaking point before being noticed. It's like how your peripheral nervous system makes you feel pain, but for the purpose of protecting you. Feeling the short-term pain might have prevented this essential limb from getting infected. There's considerable overlap between these problems and the lack of multiplayer. The trick is to get people to play together without forcing it. Players do play together, broadly speaking, through the community, but direct interaction is predominantly just through trading, and even trading is harshly criticized. No offense to the solo self-found community, but the fact that there was such a demand for this is bad news for the rest of the game. Why is PoE an online game? So other players can see our cool microtransaction skins for the 2 seconds they're in our hideout? No, I think being online is part of a greater appeal. I think new players want to play with their friends that pulled them into the game. Remember the R in ARPG? I'm not saying it's easy. Every player has different interests in playing with others, but here's where PoE shines once again. We already have options for what endgame we pursue. If we don't like one, we can focus on something else. The missing elements of cooperative and competitive multiplayer can fit naturally into this structure. The cards are already on the table, and so are the gaps between them. So, you know what I'm going to say next. Start encouraging cooperative and/or competitive play in an upcoming league. Let's get some data on how players enjoy it. Just consider some of the reasons why multiplayer is so weak, and you'll see the overlap that I'm talking about.